80,000 civil servants are on the minimum wage, and yet they're making decisions on universal credit and on asylum claims. When politicians pass the buck and blame public sector workers who can't speak for themselves, I think that's pretty shitty type of politics personally. I'm Mark Serwotka, I'm the General Secretary of PCS.
And so the big story of conference seems to be the minimal service bill. Can you just talk to me a little bit about your and your union's opposition to it?
So we already have the most restrictive union laws anywhere in Europe, and what this bill does is take it to a whole new level, because it will mean that even though you have a democratic vote to strike, an employer can tell you 20% of your union members have to go into work, and if they don't work they can be sacked. We think that's a fundamental breach of people's human rights and their right to strike, and we're committed to fighting it legally and working with other unions to try to not comply with that law, because if we let this go through, strikes will be less effective, and if they're less effective, people's paying conditions will be driven down.
The problem is that the onus really goes on to the individual worker, right? So you might not be able to absorb it as a union. What sort of contingency plans have you put into place so that you can absolve them from taking on the onus?
So clearly trade unionism is all about collectivism, and we want to try to avoid the onus being on an individual and then fighting a defensive battle. So the first stage of this is employers will want to seek to talk to unions about coming up with lists. We're clear that we shouldn't be cooperating with any drafting of who's on what list, and that the union collectively should say that we're going to oppose it. Now, the first unions that probably will be in the firing line are likely to be the transport unions, and so we will be doing everything we can to support the railway unions, and we'll be debating it this afternoon, and we hope that we collectively agree to all do everything we can to oppose the law.
Because at the moment it really feels like you're just hoping that employers won't implement the bill, that they won't take the action. I mean, is there anything concrete that you can perhaps give to the employers to prevent them from taking action?
No, because I think any compromise that undermines your right to take strike action is a compromise that is actually our own death warrant in the long run. You know, it's no coincidence, is it, that these laws are coming in when we've had more strikes in Britain than at any time in recent years, and so many of them are winning. And so the answer of the government is to try to stop you striking effectively. So it's such a fundamental issue that I think we have to commit as a whole TUC to saying we're trying to oppose this in every way that we can.
And of course you're hoping that Keir Starmer, if he's to take office next year, he will repeal it in the first 100 days. What would the consequence be if he doesn't?
Well, he has to. I mean, this is one of those pledges that he still says that he's committed to keeping, and we have to force them to publicly say that, because the consequences of a Labour government actually allowing employers, and in many cases they'll be the employer in the public sector, of forcing people to cross picket lines and go into work or be sacked is unimaginable. So Labour has to keep that commitment, and if there was any question of them not doing so, I think there would be uproar in the trade union movement.
What would that uproar look like?
Well, I think there are affiliated unions, we're not one, but I think you would see a mass campaign of trying to force Labour to drop that, were it to go down that route. Personally, I don't think they will. I think this is one thing that they realise the stakes are so high, they'll have to honour their pledge. And that's what I'm sure people will be urging him when he's here today, and Angela Rayner when she speaks tomorrow.
I mean, because yourselves and the RMT as well, you know, first in the firing line. I mean, it might be a case that Starmer just lets the railway workers hang out to dry.
Well, it'd be pretty daft if he did, because I don't think there's any way that other unions would let the RMT be isolated. I don't believe Sharon Graham in Unite or the big public sector unions would let the RMT fall at that hurdle, because they know they'll be next. And if you think about what's at stake here, it's actually, do we live in a country that is a democracy where you can vote to strike and withdraw your labour, or actually we're living in a country where employers can tell you, no matter what you voted for, you're in work or you're sacked? That would be such a massive step backwards that I think there would be probably more cooperation than on any other issue.
Well, on Sharon Graham, she gave an interview to The Times this weekend where she described Starmer's opposition as a 90s tribute act. Would you agree with that?
So I always preferred music in the 80s myself, but I think that what she says is correct, that what we do not need to do here is go back to the future, back to 1997, where Labour won an election because people hated the Tories. They had an opportunity to be radical and they decided not to be. If Keir Starmer is telling us now that his tough choice is to not tax the rich, but to force people with 3, 4 and 5 kids to live in poverty by keeping the two-child policy, his priorities are completely wrong. So she was right, I think, to give him a gentle nudge. And I hope we're right today to say, if you make promises to get elected, you should stick to those promises and enthuse people as to why they should vote Labour. If you rely on people not liking the Tories, you're taking a big risk. if you enthuse people who are living in poverty in the public sector, then actually Labour can win with a big majority. But that's what we need to hear, and I don't think we're hearing it now.
Well, last week as well, I mean, reacting to the story about RAC and crumbling concrete in schools, that Starmer wasn't able to commit to paying out of the public purse to fix those buildings. I mean, how did you react to that?
Well, it's astonishing, isn't it? Because I think people want more from an opposition. You know, if you can't commit to fixing a school, you can't fix to getting hospital waiting lists down by paying doctors and nurses proper salaries, if you can't commit to saying it's wrong that we have rampant profiteering while people are polluting our waters and giving shareholders billions of pounds in dividends, what are you for? And I think this needs to be an election about there's two choices. There's Tory Britain, which is broken, or there's a vision that people's lives can be changed for the better. At the moment, we know that Keir Starmer is not offering what the Tories are offering, but we need to find out what is his vision. And at the moment, I think the reassuring noises to the market are not enthusing anybody where I live who wants to hear something far more bold and more radical.
I just want to ask you about the former Foreign Office official, Simon McDonald. So a clip has resurfaced of him this morning, and Twitter are up in arms because he said that he voted against Brexit. And apparently this has really upset a lot of people. I mean, members in the civil service, what do you think about them expressing a personal view? Does it upset you quite as much as it upset some BBC reporters?
Well, it doesn't personally upset me, no. But what upsets me more is that I represent members who are not at that level in the civil service, but were actually sacked because they said they were voting Jeremy Corbyn on their Twitter. So you have this issue in the civil service focused, I think, more at the junior end, where people are doing very difficult jobs, but if they say anything on a private Twitter account, they can be disciplined and lose their job. And the question I ask is, if you're on the minimum wage in the DWP, working against all the odds, why can't you use your own Twitter account to indicate what your personal opinion is? So I'm not up in arms like the BBC are. I think that certainly the people we represent should have a right to express their opinions.
And what do you think about the working from home? I mean, would you encourage your members to get back into the office, or are you happy with the part-day week?
Well, we fought for people to have a right to be able to work from home. We think that COVID is a seismic moment in our economy. You know, why do people need to travel 1, 2, 3 hours to work if they can work equally effectively from home? So I take the view that there's dangers with isolation and the fact that sometimes people coming together is a good thing. But we should have a hybrid working arrangement that works not just to benefit the employers, but actually the individuals themselves. So the days of making people go in, I think, are absurd. And when Rees-Mogg put post-it notes on civil service desks saying, "Wish you were here," it was just an infantile gesture from a Tory who didn't really understand, I think, that people can work very productively from home. And we've seen that in a lot of private companies. So I think the way forward is a far more flexible hybrid way of working. And I think that is very hard now, I think, to put back in the box.
Of course, civil servants are really much in the forefront of news coverage at the moment. I mean, especially with Jillian Keegan, I think she was slightly putting the blame on the RAC situation on them. I mean, how was that received?
Well, it's appalling, and of course it's the latest in the long line of Priti Patel, Suella Braverman, Jacob Rees-Mogg. It's very demoralising for civil servants who, as we know, are paid very low salaries. 80,000 civil servants are on the minimum wage, and yet they're making decisions on universal credit and on asylum claims. So when politicians pass the buck and blame public sector workers who can't speak for themselves, I think that's pretty shitty type of politics, personally. And what I think she needs to realise is the people they attack, it saps their morale, and actually it's the last thing you really should do if you want the civil service to try and work as cohesively as possible.